Hello, Player One. Welcome to the Gaming History Club. My name is Gabby.
Hello, I'm JP, and today we will talk all about Sega's history, how it was formed, how it got started making video games, and what led to it becoming one of the biggest names in video games. Okay, Gabby, let's start off this episode by me asking you, what is your favorite Sega game and why is it the Yakuza franchise?
Why are you answering for me? But you know what? You're not wrong.
Well, I know you well enough. I mean, it's gonna be this or Crazy Taxi, isn't it?
That's true. Yeah, I definitely love the Yakuza series, and I think I spent my childhood playing Crazy Taxi quite a lot, both in console, not Sega console though. I actually played it on the PlayStation, but yes, Crazy Taxi definitely spent a lot of time playing in the arcade. But yeah, what about you actually?
So I think mine's definitely going to be Afterburner, which I didn't realize at the time that it was a Sega game, but I actually remember playing Afterburner, which we'll talk about later. So I'm not going to explain what it is now.
Mm.
But yo, Afterburner was amazing.
Yeah, it's an arcade game, right? That
Yeah,
one?
yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
But we'll
yeah.
get into that later. It's going to be one of my favorite parts to talk about, definitely. Yeah.
Oh, okay, okay, okay.
Yeah, so Player One, we decided to split this topic into two episodes. So in this episode, we'll be talking all about the very origins of Sega because that turned out to be like a really complicated topic, to be honest. And especially since Sega is a lot older than video games in general, there's just so much that we need to cover in this first episode. So we will take you through the arcade scene, as well as Sega's very first home console. And then in our next episode, we'll be covering the good old console war against Nintendo, as well as how and why Sega would later drop out of the console market and focus on making games instead. So, how about we get started, Gabby?
Yeah, sure. So, the first thing we should mention is that Sega's history is rather a complicated story, especially when you compare it to Nintendo's history.
Yeah, because, we cannot talk about Sega without mentioning Nintendo, right?
Yeah, definitely.
No. So, because compared to Nintendo, Nintendo's story is quite straightforward. It was founded, owned, and led by the Yamauchi family for more than 100 years, starting from 1889 all the way until 2002, when the last family president stepped down.
Yes, and Sega, on the other hand, is the complete opposite. It was born American and then it became Japanese. It was swallowed up by a conglomerate, it got rescued by investors, and eventually absorbed into another company.
Like loads of businessy type of things happening here with Sega, basically.
Yeah, a lot of change of ownership throughout its lifetime until now, basically. But yeah, it didn't even start as a company that makes games, but rather it was distributing games made by other companies. But anyway, a good place to start in Sega's history is with a company called Standard Games.
Yeah, Standard Games was founded by three Americans, Irving Bromberg, his son Marty Bromley, and James Humpert in 1940, Honolulu, Hawaii, USA. And with a year like 1940, you just know the Second World War is going to be a topic of discussion, right? So, Standard Games' business was distributing coin operated amusement machines, basically slot machines, to the US military bases. So, for a bit of background first on the founders of Standard Games. Irving Bromberg, he was born in New York in 1899, and he formed his very first company, Irving Bromberg Co., all the way back in 1930. So Irving was no newcomer to the industry. His company was already one of the best known and biggest distributors of coin-op machines in the US.
Yeah, so Irving's son, Marty Brumley, was born in 1919 and has worked with his dad officially since leaving high school, but unofficially since he was 12. So basically a bit of like, child labor.
Yeah, definitely. Fetch me a coffee, print these documents.
Yeah, probably that was. Oh, wait, print this
Did they
document?
have printers back in? I don't know. Okay.
You know what? We're not gonna get into that.
No.
But so Standard Games was founded by the father and son duo in Honolulu, Hawaii, along with James Humbert, a year before the U.S. even got involved in the Second World War properly, like properly in the war.
Yeah.
Yes. But the founders already anticipated the US joining the war effort and seized the opportunity to provide military staff stationed at military bases with amusement machines, mostly these slot machines. Because, you know what? They still need entertainment, right?
Oh, yeah. On a side note, by the way, Marty Bromley, he was actually working on maintaining the military slot machines in Hawaii when the Pearl Harbor attacks were happening, which Pearl Harbor is in Hawaii.
Yes. So, just to go back a little bit, Standard Games was established in 1940. The Second World War happens, and then following the Second World War, Japan is under the occupation of the Allies.
And at this point, the US Army stopped operating slot machines and they sold a lot of its inventory back to Irving Bromley in 1946. And Standard Games restored those machines before redistributing them again. So at this point, Standard Games went from initially just being like a middleman to actually also repairing these slot machines as well. And around this time, Standard Games then became known as Service Games instead. And this is probably to reflect the heavy military focus that the company had because, military service games, right?
Or probably because they started surfacing
The
those
games.
slot machines. Yeah,
Right.
Yeah, service.
But we're
games.
unsure,
Anyway,
to be honest.
yeah.
But most likely.
But by 1951, Service Games was getting into a bit of existential crisis in the US because of the Johnson Act. So, the Johnson Act, among other things, made it illegal to transport gambling devices to certain US states that didn't allow gambling, just like the slot machines that Service Games were distributing, basically. This included distribution at military bases, which was Service Games' focus at that time.
Yeah, and this is how Service Games went from being an all-American company to a multinational one. Service Games saw an opportunity to sell to the very slowly recovering Japanese economy, with Japanese people regaining some disposable income after the Second World War. And so now it sent two of its employees, Richard Stewart and Ray Lemaire, to Tokyo to establish Service Games of Japan in 1952. And they did this to once again provide slot machines to US military bases stationed in Japan specifically. But soon after, they would also find regular Japanese businesses and consumers to sell to as well, rather than only military stations.
And it's here now in 1954 that the world sees the word Sega for the first time as well. As Service Games put that name, an abbreviation of Service Games, Service Games, Sega, basically, on one of their slot machines, the Diamond Star. But that wasn't the company's name just yet at this point.
No. And you know what? Can we just appreciate a Diamond Star for a quick second? Because these look like really beautiful little slot machines. Obviously very old, cranky, but it reminds me of that Fallout style of machines that you see around and a lot of that old school jukebox vibe, right? I mean, these were some really nice looking things, to be fair.
Yes, and if you're curious as to how the Diamond Star look like, it's kind of the inspiration behind the artwork for this episode.
Okay, so that was Service Games, and now think completely unrelated to all of this. In 1954, another company was founded in Japan that was run by another American, David Rosen, and his company, Rosen Enterprises. David Rosen was a New Yorker, and he was actually stationed in Japan during the Korean War. And during his time there, he realized that the Japanese, they required photos for many things such as identification cards, rice rationing cards, employment cards, rail cards. You get the gist, just a whole bunch of photos needed to be taken for a whole bunch of cards.
Because of this need of a lot of photos, basically, what David Rosen did is he imported automated photo booths from America and brought them over to Japan. So, similarly to Service Games, David Rosen also noticed that as Japan was rebuilding their economy, the Japanese had more disposable income to use for entertainment. So by 1957, he also started importing coin-operated games to Japan as well, just like Service Games.
So now let's fast forward a little bit to 1960. Service Games now was outright banned from operating at US bases in Japan. And this is because they were under very heavy scrutiny by the US government. There were allegations of criminal business practices, including tax evasion and bribery. So what happened is Service Games, well, they got dissolved in 1960, and a new company took its place instead and bought up all of Services Games' assets. And this new company was called Nihon Gorako Busan.
By the way, as a side note, this is actually where Sega's own timeline starts. So, starting from Nihon Goraku Busan, when you visit their official website, by the way. So, I'm wondering if that's perhaps to distance themselves from the shady business practices of the past and they want to just start fresh from that point in time.
Yeah, or perhaps, the very military, American roots of the company, which, with Japanese sensibilities, it might not be something that you really want to get into all that far
Yeah,
back. I mean, they make family-friendly games as well, and so perhaps it's not something that they really want to highlight on their own website.
yeah, could be actually. But anyway, in 1965, Nihon Goraku Busan merged with David Rosen's company, Rosen Enterprises. However, in reality, it was more like an acquisition, so Nihon Goraku Busan acquired Rosen Enterprises.
Right, but David Rosen would have called it a merger at the time, kind of to save face a little bit.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. At this point in time, a new merged company would, well, emerge, and it was named SEGA Enterprises. SEGA, because that's a relic of Service Games' previous company names, and Enterprises took from Rosen Enterprises.
Right. So, finally, with all of that business stuff out the way, we can finally talk about games because now Sega Enterprises was making games too. And at the start, these were very simple games. Like, for example, those punching bags that you have to hit and you get a score the harder that you hit them, right? And very simple rifle shooter like games. But you know what? Like going this far back, there's virtually zero information on these things, to be honest, because they didn't exactly stick out much from the crowd. I mean, do you know who makes all of these punching bag games in the arcades? You don't, do you?
It's quite difficult to track back because, it sounded like one of them funfair,
Exactly,
games.
of course, yeah.
Yeah.
And so now we're in 1965, groovy baby, and Sega releases what most people would consider their first true built by themselves arcade game. But not a video game, mind you. I mean, it's still 1965. No, it's actually an electromechanical arcade game that was called Periscope. And if you're wondering, periscopes, those are the things that you look out of in submarines to see what's going on outside.
Yeah, so just like the name implies, in the game you look through a periscope and you fire torpedoes at cutout ships that were swimming past inside of the arcade cabinet. So the torpedoes were represented by lights, and the game had some electronic sounds built into it. I'm guessing it's like an explosive sound,
Yeah,
probably.
yeah, like...
Yeah.
But
Okay.
they weren't MP3s, let me tell you. No. This
No.
was like electronic, kind of like early days. But yeah, it had sounds. Pretty cool.
Definitely. So initially, Periscope was a game for up to 3 players, but a later revision in 1968 made the game a single player instead. And the single player version was the first arcade game ever to demand 25 cents for a play as opposed to a dime or 10 cents, which was, you can imagine, it was considered a premium price, definitely.
I mean, I didn't run like an inflation calculator, but 25 cents, that's, who knows, like $2 these days.
Yeah, but like just the fact that it's 2.5 times more.
What was considered normal.
Yeah, it must
Yeah.
have been pretty like, ooh, that's
Yeah.
pretty
I mean, the
expensive.
next time this happens, this is a little bit on a tangent, but the next time that would happen, that was Dragon Slayer, I believe. That was then 50 cents for the first time. So you can imagine, like, Periscope set the standard for like a really long time. Actually, yeah. And the funny thing with this game as well is that it appears to have been designed by Masaya Nakamura, who is the founder of Namco. And he made this as a title called Torpedo Launcher first, which it appears he then licensed out to Sega to build themselves. But Getting information and footage of this Periscope game is actually kind of difficult, to be honest, because unlike video games, electromechanical games, they had much more of a niche following. So information is really hard to come by these days, even with the, internet on your fingertips.
Yeah, so the history is a little bit,
Difficult
difficult to
to
find,
track back.
basically. But what was definitely certain, though, Periscope was a huge hit. It was very popular with gamers, and David Rosen from Sega himself called it a turning point in the arcade business. It was released at a time where there really wasn't a lot of new exciting machines being built, which is actually what made Sega decided to build some of their own machines in the first place.
Yeah, so a lot of the arcade machines back then, they were kind of different versions of pinball, a lot of slot machines, a lot of those slot racing games, like with the horses and stuff.
Mhm.
And games like Periscope, they were actually labeled as quote unquote novelty games. But the truth is, even to Sega, Periscope was a total surprise hit, and it kind of gave fresh life to the arcades once again. Compared to slot machines and pinball, I mean, Periscope was more of an experience. You put your head through the fake periscope and you shoot torpedoes. So it's kind of very much more lifelike. In a very toy-like fashion, yeah, but I mean, compared to pinball, to slot machines, Periscope was different. And it's actually this formula that Sega would continue to build on with some of their most popular video game arcade machines later as well. They really honed in on this experience part of playing games. Periscope was so popular that according to David Rosen, exporters from the US and Europe traveled all the way to Japan just to check out the game. So Periscope proved to Sega that they could make popular arcade machines, and guess what? This is exactly what they did now.
Yeah, so for the next 2 years, Sega was making around 8 to 10 new electromechanical arcade games every year. And many incorporated something novel to make it more of an experience. There was quite a few racing games like Grand Prix and Monte Carlo that had steering wheels. They also had a duck hunt game with a rival. And if you hear this duck hunt, you might be thinking the Nintendo Duck Hunt,
Yeah,
which is quite
with the
similar.
duck,
Yeah,
doo-doo-doo-doo.
yeah, and this
Yeah,
is the arcade version of
yes.
that basically.
How did they get away with having the same name, the two of them? You think?
Yeah, crazy,
Yeah,
right?
but there's two Duck Hunts. There's a Sega and a Nintendo Duck Hunt.
Yeah,
Interesting.
that's true. They also had some weird stuff like love testers and fortune telling machines, and these are all in the arcade.
You know what else they had? And this is something I really can't figure out, to be honest. It's a hybrid video game and electromechanical game called Heli Shooter. But you know what? Let me tell you, that's a rabbit hole for another day because to figure out what part is video game and what part is electromechanical, I think that would take me about 10 minutes now as well.
Right, but at this point, we can definitely appreciate that Sega was making games for the arcades before video games, before computer space, and before Pong, which were, the first two public video games ever, basically. At the end of 1970, Sega had opened an arcade center in Sapporo, Japan, with 125 arcade games. Again, this was before Pong.
Yeah, before Pong. But regardless of the success Sega had with these novel electromechanical arcade games, of course, once video games entered the arcades in the 1970s, they very, very quickly replaced and overtook everything that came before, including these EM arcade machines. So, what was Sega's first video game then, you might be wondering? And you know what, not surprisingly at all, for the first couple of years, starting in 1973, Sega's arcade games were all Pong clones. But you know what, this wasn't just Sega being copycats. Literally everyone was just making Pong clones for TVs and arcades, following Atari's big success with releasing Pong in 1971. So, before Atari managed to export their Pong arcade cabinets to Japan in late 1973, though, before they even made it to Japan, Sega had already released their own Pong clone there, which they called Pongtron, and slight variants of Pong as well, like Table Hockey and Goal Kick, which were both released in 1974.
And if we want to talk about games that are not Pong, so the first two arcade games from Sega that broke away from the Pong
Craze. Pong
craze,
clones.
yeah,
Yeah.
and tried to successfully diversify video games. were two arcade games from 1976 called Fonz and Heavyweight Champ. So let's talk about these games a little bit more. So Fonz was based on a character called Fonzie from a 70s TV show Happy Days. It was an early pseudo 3D games with a third-person camera perspective behind the biker, with close object drawn larger than those in the distance. The game was controlled using a realistic looking bike handlebar that would rumble if you crashed in the game. That's a first in video games too.
Yeah, the first time we had haptic feedback, and that was Sega. But you know what? It was also the first time a character from a movie or TV show was used inside of a game. And this was possible because the owners of Sega at the time, which were Gulf and Western, they also owned Paramount. And so they owned the IP for Happy Days as well to make this possible.
Yeah, and if you're wondering why all of a sudden it's Golf and Western that owns Sega, just know that Sega's ownership kept changing around, as we mentioned before. But it's all kind of a bit dry and businessy, so you know what? We'll focus on the fun things, the games, right?
You're right, the games. So, talking about the games, the other game that Sega released in 1976 that really stood out, so Heavyweight Champ, that was the first ever fist fighting video game. And the way this worked was actually really cool. So, it was a two-player game, and each one of the players, they had a boxing glove shaped controller that you would put your hand inside of, and you could move it up or down. And if you move it up or down, it would change the height of your character's fist inside of the game. And then in order to punch, you would push in the controller and out again very quickly in order to punch inside of the game. So, yeah, cool idea, actually.
Yeah, it's cool because you're kind of playing punching game literally by kind of
Punching.
simulate punching.
Yeah.
Yeah, pretty cool. So now something huge in the world of video games happened. In 1978, Space Invaders from Taito started the golden age of arcade video games. And around the same time, microprocessors started being used in most arcade cabinets. So with all this more powerful tech, games quickly improved with more varied gameplay ideas, new design choices. They get more colorful and the graphics get more detailed as well. So let's talk about a few more Sega titles that innovated the entire video games landscape after all of this technology come into play.
Yeah, let's talk about Zaxxon, released at the very end of 1981. So, Zaxxon was a hugely popular and very successful space shooter. And if only Zaxxon had been released 3 months earlier, it would have been the very first isometric viewpoint video game ever. But as it stands, that title actually goes to Treasure Island, developed by Data East. So, it wasn't quite the first isometric view video game, but it was definitely the more successful and made it a really popular viewpoint to use in video games. Zaxxon was the first arcade game, so not just any video game, but the very first arcade game that was advertised on television, and it actually had a budget of $150,000 to market this arcade game.
Okay, let's talk about some more arcade games developed by Sega's Yu Suzuki. Since no history of Sega will be complete without mentioning Yu Suzuki, it's just like how you can't separate Shigeru Miyamoto from Nintendo or Hideo Kojima from Konami. Yu Suzuki is that for Sega. Yu Suzuki is truly a gaming history hero that will definitely get his own dedicated episode from us one day. It's on the list. We'll talk about it one day, definitely. And Sega and video games in general wouldn't be the same without Yu Suzuki.
Yeah, so he was behind Sega's most popular arcade games from the late 80s, and they were motion simulator games, which were also known as Taikan games. And these involve putting the player inside of a moving cabinet or a vehicle that mimics the motion that was happening inside of the game.
Yes, so this Taikan game started with the world's first Hang On.
Yeah?
No, the game is called Hang On.
Oh, alright, sorry.
Yeah. So Hang On was released in 1985, one of the first 16-bit video games ever using Sega's Superscaler system board. So in Hang On, the game, you sit on a fake motorbike that tilts you left and right, of course, if you look inside of arcades this day, you can find a lot of this kind of games, and you can play all sort of games with this kind of mechanics nowadays.
Yeah, but Yu Suzuki, yeah, he did it first in 1985 with Hang On. But you know what? He continued to make these popular motion simulator games. So the very next year, he made one of my favorites, Outrun. And that was basically just Hang On, but inside of a Ferrari, with a gear stick, an awesome soundtrack, and another first in racing games as well. The ability to choose between different routes to take you to different stages as well. So, like, making it a tiny bit open world and, a arcade racing game from the 80s. Super cool.
Yeah, and these motion simulator games also suited well to add shooting mechanics, of course, right? And so there was Space Harrier, where you play from a third person perspective. Again, instead of a moving cabinet, you're just blasting aliens left, right, up, down, and center. Another favorite arcade cabinets for many people.
Yeah, and now finally I get to talk about Afterburner. So Yu Suzuki took this whole motion simulator technology to the absolute maximum, and in 1987 he releases Afterburner. And this honestly was the most extreme version you could make of this. So in Afterburner, you sit inside of a cockpit with a flight stick that simulates a fighter jet. And the cabinet, it has the ability to tilt, roll, and rotate. It is shaking you around like crazy, just like almost like, a real jet would as well. Super cool. I actually did play this as a kid. It was so cool.
Yeah, and there were many more Sega arcade games that came later in the 90s that's worth mentioning, like the Virtua series of games like Virtua Racing, Virtua Fighter, and other Virtua
Yes,
games.
Virtua Tennis. You forgot Virtua Tennis.
Yeah, I can't believe they also had tennis game, but yeah, those Virtua series. But you know what? Shall we move on to the home consoles now?
Yeah, good idea. But in order to do that, we're actually going to have to rewind a tiny little bit again, back to the early 80s. So arcade gaming was taking a bit of a nosedive, and this was hurting Sega's business as one of the top five manufacturers of arcade games, of course. The golden age of arcade games is now over officially, okay? And so the president of Sega at the time, Hayao Nakayama, thought that they should make use of Sega's expertise in gaming hardware, and they should enter Japan's home console market, which, by the way, at the time, it barely existed.
Yeah, because Japan's video game market was basically a lot of those home computers and Pong clones at the time, so very different than what you call console these days.
Yeah, it was in its infancy, definitely. But yeah, they got to work and they started to develop a few different models. The first, which was called the SC3000, and Sega envisioned this one to be an early home computer with games. So yeah, it came with a built-in keyboard similar to other home quote-unquote consoles, if you want to call them that. Or you could also call them home computers with games, to be fair. Yeah, whichever way you like. However, Sega soon heard of Nintendo's plans to release their upcoming home console, the Famicom, the Japanese NES basically, as a games only console. And so they developed a model that would go out alongside the SC3000, the one with the built in keyboard, and they would make another version as a standalone with just a joystick. And they called that one the SG1000, the SG standing for Sega Games.
So this SG-1000 was actually released on the 15th of July 1983, the exact same day as Nintendo's Famicom.
The exact same day, probably the exact same hour and minute, who knows?
Who knows? Yeah. But if you've never heard of SG-1000, that's probably because it wasn't really sold outside of Japan. Some rebranded versions did make it outside of Japan eventually to Australia, to New Zealand, and Taiwan, but not to the larger video games market like the US.
Yeah, so the SG-1000, it had 75 games in total over its lifetime, and they were all exclusively developed by Sega as well, which is differently to Nintendo's approach because, Sega was just not going to work together with all of their competitors from the arcades to make games, for their console and then make that money. This was different to Nintendo because Nintendo did allow third-party developers to make games for the Famicom and NES. All they had to do was apply to Nintendo to make that game for that console and then receive that official Nintendo seal of quality that I'm sure a lot of gamers are still aware of, that golden seal.
Yeah, and the difference also is that SG-1000 lacked a so-called killer app. It didn't really have like that must-have game that meant you absolutely must have the console as well. Meanwhile, if you see the Famicom, they had games like Donkey Kong, Donkey Kong Jr., and Popeye. All those recognizable games players knew from the arcades. The Famicom was also graphically better though, which basically would be more popular because they kind of cost the same, around $130.
Yeah, so the SG-1000, nowadays we would say it's been somewhat of a failure, really, but it's kind of ironic because it did actually beat Sega's original expectations for how well they would be selling this console. I guess what happened is that they realized it was a drop in the ocean compared to how well the Famicom was doing. So let's put some numbers to this. The Sega SG-1000 sold somewhere between 1.5 and 2 million consoles, while the Famicom and NES sold 62 million consoles. Let that sink in.
Yeah, I think 60 million consoles is not a small difference, in this case. So, yeah, definitely Famicom did much better. But hey, Sega focused on the positive, so we can focus on the positives here too, right? So let's look into the positive then. First of all, Yu Suzuki coded his first game, Champion Boxing, in his first year at Sega for the console, not for the arcade. It was also for the console that Yuji Naka programmed his first game for Sega before later co-creating Sonic.
Yeah, I can tell you a little bit about this one. So, Yuji Naka was asked to try and make a game that might be popular for women and girls. So, what did he do? He programmed Girls Garden. So, this is a game that has the player picking up flowers to win over a boy and prevent him from going to another girl's house.
Right. So, basically, when Pac-Man, the way they appealed to girls was to have food in the game, Girls Garden was picking up flowers. Sounds pretty stereotypical, but hey, I'm not judging.
I think, you know what? It makes sense in a weird, kind of like manly way because, you want to appeal to men. It is actually very typical. Make some shooters, make some sports games, and it worked. So I guess they thought, nah, I guess girls like food and picking flowers, so this is gonna work, right? But no.
Yeah, probably not really, is it?
Yeah, Sega understood that what was actually holding them back from, big success was the console itself. So they went to work with upgrading the SG-1000 and turning it into something that would not only keep up with the Famicom NES, but would also try to outperform it too. So the redesign and upgrade would lead to the SG-1000 Mark III, which was rebranded for the international market as the Sega Master System. And that was released just 2 years after the first SG-1000, so on the 20th of October 1985. And if you're wondering, by the way, well, what happened to the SG-1000 Mark II? Well, it was kind of unremarkable, if I'm being honest, and Sega really quickly went ahead to jump straight into the Mark III after that. And yeah, that would become the Sega Master System internationally.
Okay, now before we get into talking about the Master System, and actually before we start talking about the console wars with Nintendo and everything else that happened with Sega, I think we should leave it here for this episode because this is getting pretty long already, right?
Yeah, it's getting pretty chunky. And you know what, to be honest, there's still so much to talk about, and we want to give it justice. Sega deserves this from us.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So, Player One, thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed the first part of Sega's history.
Yeah, and let us know what your favorite Sega game or console is, Player One. Write to us on gaminghistory.club. Make sure you also subscribe and follow us on our social media. We're on Instagram and Facebook as Gaming History Club.
We'll see you next time on the 27th of May to pick up where we left off. And there's going to be lots of cool, exciting things to talk about. The Master System, the Sega Genesis, the Sega 32X, the Sega Saturn, the Dreamcast, and Sonic, of course, and lots of weird things as well, like the iDock. Yeah, you're wondering what the iDock is? You'll have to come back next time. See ya.